Chapter 16. This morning we're going to be in verses 15 to 33. Number 16, 15 to 33. Title of the sermon this morning is this: When God Swallowed a Rebellion. So let's read the text. I'll open us in a word of prayer and then we'll jump into our sermon this morning. Number 16, beginning in verse 15. And Moses was very angry and said to the Lord, "Do not respect their offering. I have not taken one donkey from them, and I have not harmed one of them." And Moses said to Korah, "Be present, you and all your company, before the Lord, you and they and Aaron tomorrow. And let every one of you take his censer and put incense on it, and every one of you bring before the Lord his censer, 250 censers. You also and Aaron each his censer." So every man took his censer and put fire in them and laid incense on them and stood at the entrance of the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. Then Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "Separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." And they fell on their faces and said, "O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and will you be angry with all the congregation?" And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to the congregation, get away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." Then Moses rose and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. And he spoke to the congregation, saying, "Depart, please, from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest you be swept away with all their sins." So they got away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the door of their tents, together with their wives, their sons, and their little ones. And Moses said, "Hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord." And as soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. We'll stop there. You will pray with me. God, as we look at a text this morning that is quite scary, quite supernatural, something that I think most of us probably can't even fathom happening. Help us to learn from it, God. I know that at first glance this text may seem to not have a lot of application to us, but God, help us this morning to see what you want us to learn from this rebellion, and Moses and Aaron, how they responded to it, and most importantly, God, what you want to teach us about how you responded to it. I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. We are jumping into the middle of a story this morning, so I want to give the context in case you haven't been here the past week or two. Bring us all up to speed, and then I'll give exposition of the text, and then I'll give us application at the end. So here's the context. Last week, we looked at these four men who were leading a rebellion against Moses and Aaron: Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and On. And it wasn't just the four of them alone. They actually had joining them 250 leaders of Israel. Well-known, respected men among the people joined them in this rebellion. Now, what was their main complaint? They think that Moses and Aaron have elevated themselves above the congregation. Essentially, they believe that the Levites should be able to do the priestly functions. That because they are all holy to the Lord, because the Lord is among all of them, they should be able to act as priests just as Moses and Aaron do. And so upon hearing this, Moses falls on his face, and then he proposes to run a test case. He tells them, he says, okay, tomorrow we'll run a test case. I want you to perform the most basic task that the priest does. I want you to burn incense before the Lord. And God is going to use that test case to show everybody who is truly set apart. Moses then summoned 2 of the 4 men. He summons Dathan and Abiram, but if you remember, they refused to come up. They said, we will not come up. And they proceed to tell 6 lies about Moses. And that's where we left off last week. We left off with these 6 lies they tell about Moses, and that's where we're going to pick up this morning. So let's look at verse 15. Exodus 16:15, Moses was very angry and said to the Lord, do not respect their offering. I have not taken one donkey from them. I have not harmed one of them. Moses was very angry. Interesting that Moses is the meekest man on the planet at this time, and yet he does not have difficulty getting angry. In fact, 5 times we see Moses get angry. When Moses told them to not leave any of the manna over until morning, but the people didn't listen, and the manna bred worms and it stank. When he came down the mountain with the 10 commandments in his hand, and he sees the golden calf and the people dancing. When Eleazar and Ithamar do not eat the goat of the sin offering. When the people let the Midianite women live when they were supposed to put them to death. And here, all of 5 times, Moses is angry. And here he's angry because they have just told 6 lies about him and are rebelling against the Lord. So Moses makes a request of the Lord. Moses says, Lord, do not respect their offering. That means don't regard their offering. Don't accept their offering. Moses says, I have not taken one donkey from them. That's probably an idiom, meaning I haven't done anything to them. I have not harmed one of them. Now remember, they are accusing Moses of being a tyrant and being a charlatan. And Moses says, I have not taken advantage of them at all. Not one Israelite have I taken advantage of. Look at verse 16 and 19. Moses said to Korah, be present, you and all your company, before the Lord, you and they and Aaron tomorrow. And let every one of you take his censer and put incense on it. And every one of you bring before the Lord his censer, 250 censers, you also and Aaron, each his censer. So each man took his censer and put fire in them, laid incense on them, stood at the entrance of the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. Then Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. Moses calls a meeting. He tells Korah to be present at this meeting. He tells the 3 men to be present, and he tells all 250 of these leaders, be present at this meeting. And he gives them the same instructions that we looked at last week. He said, I want you to take your censer, which is kind of like a pot or a pan that would be used to catch the ashes or the coals. He says, put incense in it. Put fire in it, probably in the form of coals. Then put incense on those coals, and then offer this before the Lord. This is what the priest would do. All 250 men are to have their own individual censer, their own individual incense, and Aaron's going to join them. Aaron, who is the high priest. And so they do exactly what they're supposed to. They obey as instructed. They all assemble at the entrance of the tent of meeting, each with their own incense and censer in hand. And notice what Korah does here. Korah assembled all the congregation against them. He gets the whole congregation to come together. Why? It's as if he wants them to witness this moment. Why? He's confident that he's going to be vindicated. He's confident that he's going to be validated. He believes that God's going to accept this. It's going to prove that he can be a priest, and all the people are going to see it, and Moses will be wrong. So everybody is there. The 4 men are there. The 250 leaders are there. Moses and Aaron are there. And all the congregation of Israel is there. And then one more person shows up. The glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. God shows up God is here to vindicate somebody. The question is, who will it be? Look at verse 20 to 22. And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And they fell on their faces and said, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and will you be angry with all the congregation? Now don't miss the irony of verse 20. Don't miss that irony. Korah and his rebellion have been maintaining all along. They are holy to the Lord. But who does God speak with? He speaks with Moses and Aaron. He doesn't address Korah. He speaks with Moses and Aaron. God gives them instructions. He tells Moses and Aaron, separate yourself from the congregation. Now, I think that means everybody. Separate yourselves from this people. Why? That I may consume them in a moment. This is now the third time that God planned to consume the nation of Israel and start over. Remember, the first time was on Mount Sinai when they made the golden calf. God said he was going to consume them there. The second time was when they wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb for exhorting them to go into the promised land. And now for the third time, God is ready to consume the people of Israel. It is an absolute miracle that Israel ever made it. Upon this news, Moses and Aaron, they fall on their faces. And this is now the third time as well that they plead on behalf of the people. They fall on their faces and they pray to God and they ask God one question. They say, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin and you be angry with all the congregation? Now, who is the one man? We're not told, but we're led to believe it's Korah. Korah, who's leading this rebellion. Moses and Aaron's prayer, it sounds an awful lot like Abraham's prayer for Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember when Abraham was pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, Lord, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Moses is saying, this Korah's leading this rebellion. Are you going to destroy all these people because one man is leading this rebellion? Look at verse 23 to 27. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, say to the congregation, get away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Then Moses rose and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of the Israel followed him. And he spoke to the congregation, saying, depart, please, from the tents of these wicked men. Touch nothing of theirs, lest you be swept away with all their sins. So they got away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the door of their tents, together with their wives, their sons, and their little ones. God listens to Moses' and Aaron's prayer. He decides that he's not going to consume the congregation, but he gives them instructions. He says, get away from the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Now, for some reason, On is not included here. I don't know why. Maybe he had a change of heart. I don't know. Earlier, Dathan and Abiram would not come up to Moses. They wouldn't be summoned. So what does Moses do? Moses went to them. Moses goes to them. And the elders of Israel follow him. And Moses gives instructions to all the congregation. He says, depart from the tents of these men and touch nothing of theirs, lest you be swept away in their sins, with their sins. Now, why does God give these instructions? Well, in the Old Testament, there is a concept called harem. All right, it's not there's two kinds of harems. It's not the other kind. There's a concept called harem. That term is not used here, but the idea is here. Harem meant that something is devoted to destruction. You see this over and over again in the Old Testament. If you remember when they went and took over Jericho, all the possessions, all the men and women of Jericho were harem. They were devoted to destruction. Remember, Achan stole some of the harem. The Amalekites, remember when Saul was to go and fight the Amalekites? They were devoted to destruction, but Saul kept some of them alive. These three men have now been devoted to destruction. Moses says, depart from them, touch nothing of theirs, lest you be swept away with their sins. Now, why would they be swept away? Just like Achan. Remember when Achan stole some of the harem? What happened to him? He and his entire family were killed. His whole family died as a result. And this is one time that the people actually obey. They actually do what they're instructed to do. They separate themselves from these three men. Interesting that Dathan and Abiram, they finally come out. They finally come out of their tents and they stand at the door of their tents. And not just them, their wives are there, their sons are there, and their little ones, their infants are with them. Look at verses 28 to 30. Moses said, "Hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die as all men die, or as if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord." You know that game, that he said, she said game, right? He said, she said, and it's like Moses says this, Korah says this. I don't know who to believe. Moses says that only him and Aaron can do this, and the priest. Korah says anybody can. I don't know who to believe. Moses says, well, look, you don't take my word for it. We don't have to play that game. You don't take my word for it. Hereby you shall know. You will have indisputable proof that the Lord has sent me to do all these works. You will have indisputable proof that the Lord sent me to bring you out of Egypt and to bring you into this wilderness and to lead you into this promised land. None of this has been of my own accord, as these three men suggest. And you will be given verifiable proof of that. How so? Moses says, if these men die, as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, what does that mean? Meaning if they die a natural death, they die of natural causes, or if they die from a human tragedy, such as a fatal accident or war or disease or famine or another natural calamity. If that happens, then you will know they are right, I am wrong, and I am a false prophet. And the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, meaning if they die in a way that nobody has ever died before, well, what might that be? What might that be? He says, if the ground opens its mouth and swallows them with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol. You may be wondering, who thought up this idea? Was this Moses' idea or was this God's? Did Moses come up with this? I don't know if this would have crossed my mind. Moses said that the ground would open its mouth, swallow them, and they would go down alive into Sheol. What is Sheol? Sheol is used in many different ways in the Old Testament. Here, it most likely means the grave. It just means going down to your death. Moses says, if this happens, then you will know that these men have despised the Lord. Now notice what he doesn't say there. He doesn't say, if this happens, then I will be vindicated. That's not what he says. He simply says, you will know that these men have despised the Lord. Look at verse 31 to 33. As soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with all their households and all the people that belonged to Korah and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. God wastes no time. As soon as Moses finished speaking this prophecy, the ground under them split apart. I love the anthropomorphism here. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them. Not just them, their whole households. All the people who belonged to Korah, all their goods, everybody who was associated with them, they all that belonged to their families went down alive into Sheol. God buries them alive. God swallowed their rebellion. We'll stop there with our exposition. Application of the text. I have 6 points. I'm going to give them up to you up front because they're all short. I purposely I've worded it this way, you'll see. And then I'll go back through them. So just really quick. Number 1, the meek get mad. Number 2, the leaders must be above reproach. Number 3, the mature pray for mercy. Number 4, the wise discern when to distance. Number 5, the wicked go down alive to Sheol. And number 6, the humble wait on the Lord. Let's start with number 1. The meek get mad. The meek get mad. There are 2 men in Scripture that are specifically said to be meek. Moses and Jesus. Numbers 12:3. Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth. And Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am lowly in heart. Matthew 11:29. But Moses and Jesus have this in common. They both are meek men. But that's not the only thing they have in common. Both of them also got angry. When Moses heard the 6 lies told by Dathan and Abiram, he wasn't just angry. The text says he was what? Very angry. He was very angry. On at least 5 different occasions, Moses got angry. And so while Moses may be the meekest man on the planet, he still got angry. The same is true for Jesus. Jesus got angry at the Pharisees' hardness of heart. He looked around, grieved at their hardness of heart. He looked around in anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. Jesus got so angry that on 2 different occasions, he went into the temple and overturned the money changers' tables and drove them out with a whip. Now, why does this matter? Often when it comes to our personalities, we end up getting pigeonholed into a binary category, right? Either we are a gentle, meek soul, or we're a passionate, fierce soul. And I understand that personalities are not binary, right? I get that that's painting with a very broad stroke, but often we get pigeonholed and painted in these categories. We're a gentle, meek soul, maybe more laid back, type B, maybe passive, chill, whatever phrase you want to use. Or we're passionate, fierce, feisty, salty, right? We often get painted in those 2. And while there may be some truth to this categorization, we must not let self-labels become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we are a passionate person by nature, and we do have some of those in our church, if we are a passionate person by nature, we need to tether that passion to meekness. Meekness is the water that keeps our cauldron from becoming too salty. And if we are by nature a meek, gentle person, we have a lot of those. We must learn to get angry when it's warranted. We must learn to get angry when it's warranted. Anger, when warranted, is a symptom. A symptom of what? It reveals we care. We care. Just as a runny nose reveals that you have a cold, anger, not always, but can reveal that you care. The meek get mad. One of the reasons why some of us don't get angry when we should get angry, and I say this with all love, is because we don't care. At the bottom, we don't care enough. The meek, don't confuse thinking that I am this kind of person. Moses was this kind of person. Jesus was this kind of person. And they both got angry when it was warranted. Number 2, the leaders must be above reproach. Leaders must be above reproach. We've been going through elders and deacons on Friday nights. One of the weeks we looked at qualifications for elders. I find it interesting that in both the 1 Timothy passage and the Titus passage, the qualification is listed both in both passages. And it's the qualification of being above reproach. It carries the idea of being blameless. Not sinless, but blameless. Now, blameless doesn't mean you won't be blamed. All leaders will be blamed. We see that right here. But to be above reproach means that to live in such a way where there is no ongoing unrepentant sin in your life. There is no area of your life where you have made peace with your sin. Now, Moses was above reproach. He was blameless. And yet the people still blamed him. They still blamed him. They accused him of bringing them out of a land flowing with milk and honey. They accused him of trying to put them to death in the wilderness. They accused him of exalting himself as prince over them. They accused him of not bringing them into a land flowing with milk and honey. They accused him of being a charlatan, pulling the wool over the people's eyes. But Moses asserts, he says, I have done none of this. I have not taken one donkey from you. I have not harmed one of you. You see, one of the reasons that leaders must be above reproach is not only because they are held to a higher standard, which is true they are, but because the world is always looking for something to reproach. Sometimes even from the church. People are always looking for something to reproach. Now listen to me. If you're like, well, I'm not a leader, what's point 3? This is not just true for leaders. Remember, we are to imitate the faith of our leaders. So what's good for the goose is good for the, I don't remember that phrase, but whatever that phrase, you know the phrase. We are to imitate the faith of our leaders, which means we are all to strive to be above reproach. As mothers and fathers, we are to strive to be above reproach. Why? Because the world is looking to reproach your mothering and your fathering. They're looking for it. As workers at our jobs or as students in the classroom, we must strive to be above reproach. Why? We bear the name of Christ. The world is looking for a reason to reproach you, just like these men. They are looking for a reason to blame you. All the more reason we must strive to be above reproach. Number 3, the mature pray for mercy. The mature pray for mercy. This is now the 3rd time that the Lord planned to wipe out all the Israelites and start over. It's also the 3rd time that Moses prays for mercy for the people. It takes great maturity to pray for mercy, doesn't it? Especially when someone has wronged you, someone's offended you, someone's slandered you, someone's reviled you, someone's mistreated you. In our flesh, we want justice. In our flesh, we want judgment. We want God to deal with them accordingly. How easy it would have been when God said to Moses, Moses and Aaron, separate yourself from the congregation. For Moses to be like, okay, see you guys. Just, I've done that. And be like, hey, I tried. I tried. I tried. And just distance himself and let God consume them. Start over. Now, if that happened, suppose Moses, after that happened, he kind of questioned, man, did I make the right decision? I don't know. You know what? Next week, we're going to see that it would have been the right decision in the eyes of man. Because they don't learn their lesson. These people never learn their lesson. They don't change their ways. Even after the earth swallows them, they blame Moses. And yet Moses still prays for mercy for them. He still prays. Why? Because that's what men and women of God do. The mature pray for mercy. I want you to think of somebody right now in your life that you have conflict with. Think of somebody in your life right now that you have conflict, even if it's minor. Think of somebody that you have conflict. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's a boss. Maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's a fellow church member. Maybe it's a housemate. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's a neighbor. Have you prayed for God to show them mercy? The mature pray for mercy. 4, the wise discern when to distance. The wise discern when to distance. God told Moses, say to the congregation, get away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Depart from the tents of these wicked men. Touch nothing of theirs, lest you be swept away in their sins. When God is, why? Because when God decides to open up the earth, God's not going to discriminate. It doesn't matter if your name is Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, or Joseph, Paul, and Peter. If you're there, everyone that's near them is going to die. The earth's going to swallow everybody who is in the vicinity of these 3 men. Now, if one was wise, they would listen to these instructions and they would distance themselves. They would distance themselves from these men. One of the most difficult parts of the Christian walk is discerning how to be in the world, but not of the world. It's one of the most difficult things to do in the Christian walk, is it not? How to be in the world, but not of the world. God has given us 2 seemingly contradictory commands. Jesus said, you are the light of the world. Let your light shine before others. Matthew 5:14-16. And Paul said, therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them. 2 Corinthians 6:17. Now those seem to contradict each other, don't they? We are called to be light to a dark world. We are called to be salt to a decaying world. We are called to be a healing balm to a hurting world. And we are called to be separate. The wise discern when to distance. Brothers and sisters, sometimes the right thing to do is simply get away. Sometimes the right and wise thing to do is just get away. When Joseph was being tempted by Potiphar's wife, this was not the time for him to try to talk sense into her. The wise thing to do was to distance himself, run away. Some of you may have friendships, or you may develop friendships in the future that are not for your good. This friendship is not for your good. Some of you may get into a relationship that is not for your good. Some of you may be working a job, or maybe you will work a job that is not for your good. And you will need wisdom from God to discern, do I stay in this or do I get out? Do I stay in this or do I distance myself? It would not have been wise for the Israelites to try to exhort these men. It would not have been wise for them to stay near their tents and be like, I can't abandon them. They're my friends. I need to exhort them. That would not have been wise. You'd have been swallowed too. The command was to get away. The wise discern when to distance. 5. The wicked go down alive to Sheol. I find it interesting how God chose to put these men to death. He didn't strike them with the plague. He didn't give them a heart attack. He didn't send a tornado. He buried them alive. I think this is powerfully symbolic of what happens to all the lost. They go down alive to Sheol. You see, God has given us all a choice. Everybody in this room has the exact same choice, and here's the choice. We can either enter heaven as dead men and women, or we can enter hell as alive men and women. See, the wilderness felt like death to these men. Felt like death. And so therefore they rejected it. They thought that true life was back in Egypt. Man, that was the life. It was flowing with milk and honey. Man, would that we could go back there. And as a result, God gave them physical death. You see, God will bring us into the wilderness to test us. That's what he's doing when he brings us to a wilderness. He is testing us. And if we despise the wilderness, if we despise the testing of God, if we desire to go back to Egypt, and that becomes a consuming narrative in our life, God will not bring us into the promised land. Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. It is far better to be under the weight of the cross than to be under the weight of the earth. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world, but to only be swallowed by that world? You can be cross-free and carefree, but you will also be heaven-free. The path to the promised land is through the wilderness. That's the path. God takes everybody through the wilderness. Number 6. Last point. The humble wait on the Lord. The humble wait on the Lord. Moses was given tremendous power. When he threw down his staff, it turned into a serpent. That's pretty cool. When he put his hand into his cloak, pulled it out, it was leprous. Put it back in, pulled it out again, it was back to normal. When he lifted his staff over the waters, the Red Sea parted. When he climbed up Mount Sinai, he beheld the glory of God. And so when these men challenged Moses, when they came to Moses and they said, hey, we can all do what you do. I don't know about you, but I might expect Moses to perform some miracle in front of them. Perhaps Moses would seek to vindicate himself right then and right there. Maybe like James and John, who wanted to call down fire from heaven to consume the Samaritans. Maybe Moses would call down fire from heaven and just consume them. Oh yeah? Who's laughing now? But he doesn't. That's not what Moses does. Why? Because the humble wait for the Lord. The humble wait for the Lord. Moses waits for God to vindicate him. And vindicate him God does. God does perform something new, something that had never happened before. He swallows these men. Friend, maybe you are waiting for an answer from God. I know some of you are. I know maybe many of you are. Maybe you're waiting for an answer from God. Maybe you are waiting for vindication. Maybe you're waiting for validation from God. Maybe you're waiting for direction from God. May I exhort you, don't take matters into your own hands. Don't make decisions in your own wisdom. Wait for the Lord. He will give you what you need. He will. He will give you what you need when you need it. The humble wait on the Lord. Let's pray.